the public square has definitely shifted to the internet.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining me for another installment of our one-on-one interview series. Today, I'm joined by our special guest, Mr. Richard Mortimer. Richard, thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me, Mr. Nosbich.
Yeah, Richard, if you would like to take a moment to introduce yourself, tell people what you're about, what you do, and give a brief introduction.
Yeah, no problem. I go by Richard Mortimer. I use a pseudonym to keep my identity safe because in the, advocating for my cause as a radical First Amendment activist, I find myself embroiled in a lot of controversy at times. I've been doing this since I first went to university and, joined a number of clubs dedicated to debates and other sort of activities. And ever since then, I've sort of taken my fight for the First Amendment online to Twitter and different message boards.
Absolutely. Yeah. Awesome. So my first question, why is the First Amendment important? What is its goal and purpose?
Well, the First Amendment's important because, it's the foundation of democracy. It's the foundation of this country. There's a number of different aspects of it. I'm perhaps most interested in the free speech aspect of it. But of course, as I'm sure you're aware, there's aspects relating to, religion, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and the right to petition. All these things, you couldn't have a functioning democracy without these things. It's what prevents us from falling to totalitarianism, as you see in China under Xi Jinping and in Russia and North Korea. I really think the First Amendment is probably what separates us most importantly from people like that and people within our own country who want to make us more like that.
So speaking of that, you're a self-described radical free speech absolutist. What does that mean? Are you saying things like even child porn and the stealing of intellectual property should be legal?
I think the child pornography question and it's a little bit out there. I think in terms of radical free speech, I think there's a lot to say about speech, but there's a very different thing when it comes to child abuse. I would not say I would advocate for that. There's quite a bit of difference, though. I think there's a lot of gray area and interesting room for discussion here when you get into the aspect of, maybe of drawings, or I'm not sure if you're familiar with, lolly hentai, animated drawings of girls who, fictional, by the way, who may be 13 or 14 or so, or cartoon characters, things like that, where, you sort of starting to this idea where it is a victimless crime. And, there's a big difference between obviously child abuse and someone drawing maybe, let's say, sandy cheeks and SpongeBob in a sexual scenario. Actually, there's a Supreme Court case in this, actually, Miller versus California, I believe from the early 1970s, where they kind of, based on pornography in general, they created this obscenity test, which, things that are obscene without any sort of socially redeeming value is what the court came up with, was not covered by the First Amendment. And I think even that's a little bit too far. If you want to draw the craziest thing possible, or if you want to, make a story of it, if you want to exercise speech or, something that is just related to you and your intellectual creation, I think that's completely separate from an activity that involves you harming another individual.
And what about intellectual property or trademarks?
I think that's one of the things too, where I think if you really are serious about sort of the First Amendment as a whole and, free speech protection, that intellectual property is really, I don't believe, should be protected in the same way it is now. And I think so much can be said about the fact that these companies and such have taken advantage of that. You look at Walt Disney, which has expanded its copyright of Mickey Mouse and such, dozens and dozens of times and gotten a law change. Does Walt Disney really own Mickey Mouse in a sense that it belongs only to them? It's been such an iconic part of the American story for so long now that, it's kind of crazy that you can create your own story that has Mickey Mouse in it, and they'll come and sue you and, take everything you own and attack you with your lawyers. I really think for the intellectual property side too, that, once it's out there in the ether, it's kind of out there. Someone discovers it and wants to make a story with it, if they want to, write about it, or if they want to use it for their own purposes, that shouldn't be an issue. I would say luckily in this country we have pretty good parody and satire kind of protections for people who want to engage in that sort of thing. But in general, I think you know we need to walk back the court a little bit on that.
Under your definition of free speech, would things like selling U.S. intellectual property or even government secrets, military secrets to foreign countries, or even pronouncing government secrets and military secrets online or in a public forum, would that be protected under the radical free speech absolutist agenda?
I don't know about selling. I think there's a kind of it's not a commercial thing to me. When I talk about free speech, it's more about kind of the spirits of freedom and being able to do what you want. I think there's a difference between sort of taking something for profit, for personal gain, for purely monetary reasons, and trying to hurt business. We have to respect that there is a sort of commercial spirit here in America that makes this country so great. So there's definitely makes sense to kind of limit in that regard. But I think when it comes to things like look at Edward Snowden, he's currently living in Russia, having to flee from the U.S. government because he exposed their lies about them spying on us. And that's not apparently not covered by the First Amendment there. I mean, they want to try him for treason and would throw the book at him if he came back and stepped back in America. Where the founding fathers really have said that's okay, I don't think so. I think there is a reason why the First Amendment was originally written so broad, although maybe we can talk more about the history of it in another question.
Mm-hmm. What are the biggest threats to free speech in the U.S. today?
Well, I'm glad you asked that. And I don't think the threats is actually from necessarily the government, which it was originally written for. I think the threats to free speech comes more today from our culture and kind of a self-censorship, and also from big corporations. There's a lot of debate that can be had about this idea of the public square now being online or maybe on Twitter or other websites. So yeah, you might not be able to go out, let's say on the street corner and, say what ideas you want. But if you go on, let's say Twitter or somewhere else, you might get banned. And of course, the argument is that Twitter is a private company. But we're getting to the point where the internet has invaded our lives so much that is it really fair or in the spirit of the First Amendment, in the spirit of free speech to allow these corporations and other avenues which may not have that amendment apply to them have such a drastic change in our life? And also too, this idea of cancel culture, which I'm sure you're aware of. Of course, legally there's nothing to stop a group of people from silencing you or kicking you out from saying they disagree with. But you look at things like what happened to Kanye West and Adidas. Kanye West may have had some what we might say crazy ideas, some crazy statements, but I think that was his right as a free American to say those things. To bring the nets and the Yoo-hoo bottle and make a Netanyahu impersonation on Alex Jones. I mean, it was outlandish, but then he was dropped by Adidas. Had his livelihood threatened, is having his kids taken away in the courts. And you might say, well, yes, of course, none of this goes against the First Amendment. But I think when you get into the spirit of things, the threat is coming not necessarily from the government these days, but from corporations and society as a whole.
So is the threat coming from the left or the right?
I think mostly from the left, although there's definitely segments on the right. I think the reason why I jumped to the left is because currently the left is prevailing in society. Maybe politically things might be relatively split, but if you at least go to institutions like universities and major corporations, they lean predominantly left, and these are the institutions that currently have power in our society. So I'd say that.
So you're a leader in the Incel Movement. What is the Incel Movement? How do you use your First Amendment rights to advance your cause?
Well, I've definitely been called that before, incel or involuntary celibate. I've also been called what's called a fakecel or a fake involuntary celibate, which is someone who pretends to be a involuntary celibate for social clout, but actually does have sex with women. That's been a kind of a controversial opinion, mostly on Twitter, right-wing spaces or so. Now, I think the modern word incel has become kind of very diluted compared to the original. This idea of, I think we all have this idea of incel, at least in the modern lexicon, as someone who's just a misogynist, who's just hateful, who's a misanthrope. But I think if you go back to the history of these things, like, excuse my language here, sluthate.com, one of the earlier message boards for incel activity, it was much more about this idea of being so ugly you couldn't get a girlfriend, and expressing a lot of the members would express hatred at women. So I've definitely been described as an incel. I definitely hang out with some of those boards, interact with some of those members. I'm not sure if I would be considered a leader myself, but yeah, we definitely use the First Amendment to kind of air our grievances and just discuss many of the problems facing modern society, especially when it comes to dating and hookup culture. And people like to laugh at the incel community for sort of being hateful, misogynist, and just being ridiculous and out there. But I think if you really look at the data, um, something like 60% of men 18 to 29 are single, but only 30% of women are. Well, the numbers actually kind of show that there's more truth to the ideas presented by the incel community than there aren't. And when it comes to the First Amendment, just these saying these ideas, on Reddit, all the major forums for incels were banned. On Twitter, you can get banned for saying these things. If you express incel ideas at university, you can be, threatened with expulsion for having a hateful ideology. When in reality, you're just someone who wants to examine the facts. And I think that's why the First Amendment is so important, is because it allows us to examine and have debates and get to the truth. And well, personally, I think that's a lot of what the incel community is about.
Excellent. So, how do you use the First Amendment in your everyday life?
Well, I use it a lot. I want to keep my identity mostly secret, but I do attend a public university, luckily, and I also work for the federal government, I will say. So um, both those institutions, work and school are very important, and luckily they have very strong First Amendment protections. In my day-to-day life, it allows me to kind of express my thoughts and feelings, to build a community with others, and debate and find the truth without fear of having my livelihood threatened.
Excellent, Richard. So, do you have any final thoughts, ways people can get in touch, ways people can learn more about what you're passionate about, get involved? This is sort of your open mic moment. Any final messages, anything like that?
I would just say, the best place I think to get involved currently is on Twitter. Elon Musk has gotten a lot of flack recently, but I think his movement towards making the site more open for those who, of all beliefs, I think has definitely been an improvement. There's a lot to be said about the way America's changed over the past 20 years, but the public square has definitely shifted to the internet. I'm not going to advocate or push my sort of personal media links. I prefer to keep myself private, and I know I have many ideas and beliefs that some would not agree with. So, prefer to keep that to myself in that regard. But I think really just get involved in the internet, go on the internet, try and find a community of people who believe in what you believe, and make that community, reach out, find people. I think people forget that the First Amendment isn't just about free speech, which is most of what we focused on, but also includes freedom of association. Um, being able to associate with who you want and sort of create groups together. So I think my advice to those listening is, find something you're passionate about and go online and find that group that you can reach out with. So yeah, that would be my advice.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Mr. Mortar, for joining us. We appreciate it.
Yes, thank you so much, Mr. Nosvich, and I'd be happy to speak to you anytime.